Hi, everyone. This is Karen Dudek-Brannan. And if you are here, it means you might be looking for ways to better treat your students with language disorders. So what I do on my blog and YouTube channel, whichever way you've managed to happen upon this video, is that I show SLPs how to get better results with less effort by using the best evidence-based treatments for language therapy. So today I'm going to do a reboot of one of my blog posts per the request of my members of my audience. So the members of my mailing list and some of the members of my paid premium community. And there were some requests to do some audio recordings so that you could listen to some of this information while you're driving to work. So what I'm going to do is go through and give you an audio version of one of my top requested blog posts, and one of the posts that answers some of the questions that I get a lot from SLPs. And the question that we're going to talk about today has to do with making your therapy more functional. So if you are an SLP in the school systems, you may have struggled to figure out how to make your therapy relevant to what's going on in the classroom, and you may feel like what you're doing is kind of contrived. Maybe it feels just like drill and practice, or just what I like to call drill and kill, where you're just kind of doing rote memorization, and you're not really sure if that practice that you're doing in therapy is actually going to help your students. For example, one of the biggest things that we work on is getting our students to remember definitions of words, because we know that we need to define vocabulary words, and our students need to do that in class. And sometimes we're often asked to work on some of those things with our students, and we end up kind of feeling just like a teaching assistant or a tutor rather than a clinician. And we're not always sure if we're doing the right things. So I'm just going to answer that question by talking about one essential skill that you can be tracking in your therapy. And the reason that I'm talking about this skill is because it's one of those things that we get asked to work on a lot, and we're not really sure if it's functional or contextualized. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute here. But if you are wondering, as a school SLP or as an SLP working with students with language disorders, and you're thinking, how do I actually teach them something that is going to benefit them in the long haul? This is one thing to start with. If you are feeling like I've got a million skills to work on and I don't even know where to start. So with that, I'm going to go through and read you the blog post. So we'll start at the beginning. And the original title was Expressive Language Development. Here's one skill you should be tracking. So here we go. Expressive language grows at a rapid rate during the school-age years. Yet with all the different skills we could be monitoring, it's a challenge to focus on the heavy hitters that make a true difference in academic performance. When it comes to expressive language and vocabulary, we know this area is massive. We also know that it's difficult to tell if students really know words. It's also a challenge to find ways for our students to show us what they know. Many of our students with expressive language disorders may have the knowledge in their head, but aren't able to organize their ideas into coherent statements. Sometimes students may know what a word means, but they don't know how to explain it to us to prove it. So that's why today I'm going to talk about one key indicator of expressive language: our students' ability to define words. Word defining is a key indicator of language growth for several reasons. First, we need to have the underlying linguistic knowledge to give a good definition. In other words, we need to know what the word means. Second, we need to have the underlying MetaLinguistic knowledge to give a good definition. We need to know what the sentence structure to use so that we successfully convey the right information about that word when we go to explain it. This also has an element of perspective taking, because we need to think to ourselves, how would I explain this word to a person who doesn't know what it means? It's often the case that students with expressive language difficulties struggle more due to this component rather than simply knowing what the word means. So a lot of times our students struggle more with being able to give you the information to explain it rather than just simply not knowing the word. The MetaLinguistic competence required to define a word is closely tied to expressive language abilities. The ability to give a good definition is also a skill that impacts academic performance. So for these reasons, I've devoted this entire post to discussing word definitions and how they improve through the school age years. But first, let's dispel an objection I often hear when it comes to addressing word definitions in therapy, which is that teaching a student to define a word isn't, quote, functional. Now, there's a lot of talk about doing therapy and assessments in functional situations. And what we're referring to when we use any of these terms are called contextualized situations. And of course, it makes sense that we'd want children to use language skills in real functional contexts. And while the general thought among many of the experts in the field is that observing language in a contextualized situation is often more meaningful, there are some exceptions to this rule, especially when it comes to both assessment and what you're actually working on in therapy. And word definitions are one of those exceptions. So defining a word is structured, it's a structured formal task. So generally speaking, it's often considered to be decontextualized, meaning it's a little bit less functional. It's a little more structured. It's not something that you do in context. It's something that you do more out of context. However, because the ability to define a word requires that perfect blend of linguistic and metalinguistic skills all in one, it's not only important for our students to have this skill to succeed in school, but it can also give us an eye-opening view of our students' expressive language abilities, particularly when it comes to vocabulary. So often just seeing if our students can define a word can really give us a good picture of whether they have that blend of linguistic and metalinguistic skills. If you're having students memorize definitions or just copy them from a dictionary, then something like that may not be beneficial. But on the other hand, if you're studying the meanings of words and then also studying the syntax used to explain them, then this actually can increase your students' metalinguistic competence and can increase the chance that they're going to generalize that skill and really remember the word versus just memorize it for the test. And let's be honest, a lot of our students can't even memorize it for the test. So if we are going to work on this skill, it is necessary for us to know how it typically develops. Now, we know that word definitions increase in quality and quantity as students get older, and that we're better able to explain different types of words as we mature. So, for example, nouns tend to be easier than verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So nouns are those definitions that tend to be fine-tuned more quickly than the other words. We also improve our ability to define abstract words as we get older. We also know that the meta component of using the correct sentence format is difficult for students with diagnosed expressive language issues. So there's no shocking findings there, but we generally need more information. I did explain in a discussion of morphology on my blog, which I'll link to below this video, that children start to develop metalinguistic competence around 6 to 7 years old, which means they have the potential to reflect on the format of definitions. So it makes sense that most of the information about the developmental progression of word definitions that we have available tends to start at age 5 on up. So that's why I'm going to start with kindergarten as I go through this progression. So we'll start with kindergarten, move up from there. A lot of this information that I'm sharing comes from the work of Marilyn Nippold, and I'll also cite some of those sources below this video. A lot of it comes from one of her textbooks, but then there is some information from some of her articles in peer-reviewed journals. So let's start with kindergarten. So when children are 5 to 6 years old, they can usually state 1 to 2 features when describing nouns. So that might mean they might be able to tell you 1 or 2 things about that word. The caveat here is that these definitions are often vague and don't contain the key defining characteristics of words they're describing. So many kids this age don't know what's known as an Aristotelian definition, which has the syntactic structure of an X is a Y that Z. So this format is essential in the definitions of nouns because it helps to structure a definition in a way that provides the most relevant features of the object, which for nouns includes a category. When children are age 5, many of them haven't developed the metalinguistic skills necessary to correctly use the Aristotelian format. They may say things that are technically correct, but not the defining characteristics needed to fully explain the word's meaning, like the category. So for example, they may tell you it's pink or it plays in the mud for the word pig, for example. So they might say a pig is pink and it plays in the mud, but they may not be giving you all the information that would be needed to explain the word to someone who'd never heard of a pig. In grades 1 through 3, metalinguistic competence grows, and so does the ability to use categorical information and correct syntax and definitions, and this skill gradually emerges from ages 6 to 8. Now, I know I'm not giving you a lot here in this age range, but this alone is a key development because the metalinguistic ability to do this task enables kids to learn words independently at a rapid rate. And children are also able to define other types of words at this age, and they start to be able to define verbs and adjectives. But this skill still tends to be more difficult for them than nouns, and usually the difficulties stem from issues with syntactic structure rather than their semantic knowledge. In grades 4 through 5, most children are able to consistently use that Aristotelian definition format for familiar concrete nouns, and they may also be able to use this proper definition format for more technical and abstract nouns, but they're much less consistent with this. Same goes for defining verbs and adjectives, although these skills are continuing to emerge. By the time children reach 5th grade, around 10 years old, they've solidified their ability to use the Aristotelian definition format with not just the category, but also giving you additional features of the word. So for pig, they may be able to tell you a pig is a type of farm animal that's pink and cools itself in the mud. With regards to other types of words, such as verbs and adjectives, we see a similar pattern with skills getting more accurate with age, and errors still more tied to syntax rather than semantics. In grades 6th through 7th, children tend to have the ability to define abstract nouns. That starts to improve, and they may still have difficulty pinpointing the key defining features like category for those more abstract words, but their growth is continuing and the growth with other types of words continues. And then in grade 8 and beyond, so between the ages 13 through 18, abstract definitions of nouns improve and children also become more consistent in their ability to define adjectives and verbs with correct syntactic structure. By the time we hit young adulthood, our ability to define all types of words with correct format, including more abstract terms, begins to solidify. It's important to note that regardless of where your students are in this stage of development, they are always emerging in these skills, and they need explicit instruction and definition format to master these skills because they're essential to academic success. So this means that it's beneficial to continually introduce definition formats to children early on in their academic careers to prepare them for the future and to encourage them to read as much as possible, because children who read more progress through these stages with greater ease than those who don't. Now, I'm willing to admit that I still get stumped when my students ask me to define certain words, both with my ability to explain them as well as my ability to teach my students how to define them correctly. So what I'm saying here is that don't be stressed if your students aren't perfect with this skill as you're teaching it. And don't be stressed if you're not perfect either. You can learn along with your students and know that this will continue to build and improve over time. So right now, as I wrap this up, I just wanted to mention that I am going to leave a link with some of my references below this video. One of them is Marilyn Nippold's text, and there is a great table. It's table 5.2 in her book, and on that, I believe, is page 109, where she outlines some of this information even further. So the developmental progression of word definitions and why it's important. But right now, if you are wondering how you can get started with working on definitions with your students, I do have a free download to share with you. And it is a template that will help you teach that Aristotelian definition format for nouns for your students. So there is a link that you can click below this video to sign up for that. You'll also be added to my mailing list. So if you're feeling like you have no idea where to start with language therapy to make it more functional and make sure that you're evidence-based so that you're actually helping your students improve in school, you'll want to check out that download and also join the mailing list to get more articles and resources just like this one. So with that, feel free to click that link below and grab that download, and thank you so much for listening.